As Steve alluded to you, I'm going to scare you, I guess, because the topic of the message this morning is fear, but hopefully you've noticed that it's an acronym, and I've used that. It's not novel with me, I've seen it before, but it stands for false evidence appearing real. And we live in a time and in a culture where people are very fearful. And the question is, need we fall into that category? And the answer resoundingly is no. And the text of our message is taken from Matthew chapter 8, verse 26, in which Jesus, responding to some disciples in a boat, say, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Now, I would encourage you to read the entirety of Matthew chapter 8 to get the entire context, because I can only do so much and spend so much time with you, but the story is riveting. But at the conclusion of this incident, Jesus is awakened from sleep and basically says, "Why are you so afraid? Why do you have so little faith?" And we live in a culture now with stay-at-home orders. There's been a slowdown in the economy. There are flare-ups in the Middle East. There are upswings, allegedly, in global warming, and there are breakouts of Al-Qaeda cells now in Iran. A demented dictator in North Korea is collecting nuclear weapons like some people collect fine wines. COVID has crossed our borders. It's taken its toll on human lives. The topic du jour of late is now domestic terrorism, which contains the word what? Terror. I mean, we fear being sued. We fear finishing last. We fear going broke. We fear the mole on our back or the new kid on the block or the sound of the clock as it ticks ever so closer to the grave. And we postulate investment plans. We create elaborate security systems. We legislate a stronger military, and yet today, we depend on mood-altering drugs more than any other generation in our history. You know, church, fear has never written a symphony. It has never written a poem. Fear has never negotiated a peace treaty. It's never cured a disease. Fear has never pulled a family out of poverty or a country out of bigotry. Fear has never saved a marriage or a business. But you know, courage does. Faith does. People who refuse to consult with or cower to their timidities, they do. But fear itself, it basically herds us into a prison and then just slams the door shut. So this morning, I wanted to ask you, what if faith, not fear, was your default reaction to threats? Envision just one day, where the dread of failure or the dread of rejection or the dread of calamity was absent from your day. Can you imagine life with no fear? That's the very possibility behind Jesus' question. Why are you afraid? Now, at first blush, we wonder if Jesus is even being serious. I mean, maybe he's kidding, or maybe he's teasing. You know, he's like pulling the disciples' collective legs. But Jesus doesn't crack a smile. He's dead earnest. And so are the men who are asking Jesus the question, because a storm has turned their Galilean cruise into a Titanic nightmare. Here's how one of them remembered the trip. Jesus got into a boat, and his followers went with him. A great storm arose on the lake, so that waves covered the boat. Now that's Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 and 24. And as the gospel implies, these are Matthew's words, and he remembered, I think, very well this terrible storm and the bouncing boat. And he was careful, I believe, in his choice of words and terminology, because not just any noun would do. So I think he pulled the thesaurus off the shelf and started going down the column, hunting for a descriptor that would explain what he was feeling. That feeling of exploding waves coming across the bow. And he probably bypassed terms like, it was a spring shower, or it was a little squall, or it was a cloudburst. Those didn't capture, I think, what Matthew was feeling, especially that night. He recalled more winds than whitecaps. So his finger follows the column down a little bit further until he lands on the word that works for him. And in the Greek, the word is seismos, S-E-I-S-M-O-S. It's a quake, or it's a trembling eruption of the sea and the sky. And so in Matthew's words in the Greek, he says, a great seismos arose on the lake. And that term still occupies a spot in our vocabulary. A seismologist studies earthquakes. A seismograph measures them. And Matthew, along with a crew of recent recruits, experienced a seismos that shook them to their core. In fact, Matthew uses that same word in only 2 other occasions throughout the entirety of his gospel, and there are 28 chapters. One time he uses it to describe Jesus' death when Calvary shook. That's Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 through 54. And then he uses the word again at Jesus' resurrection when the graveyard trembled. That's Matthew chapter 28, verse 2. You see, for Matthew, the stilled storm shared equal billing in the trio of Jesus' greatest shakeups. He defeated sin on the cross, he defeated death at the tomb, and he silenced the disciples' fear on the sea. And Matthew describes it as this storm came up suddenly, this sudden fear. And we know fear was sudden because the storm was. Another translation reads, suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea. And I think one minute the disciples are shuffling cards for maybe a mid-journey game of gin, and the next they're gulping Galilean sea spray. Peter and John, who are very seasoned sailors, struggle to keep the sail down. And Matthew, the tax collector, a confirmed landlubber, is trying to keep his lunch down. The storm is not what this tax collector had bargained for. As proof, you sense Matthew's surprise in the way that he links the 2 sentences together. Jesus got into a boat and his followers went with him. That's the first sentence. The second sentence, a great storm arose on the lake. Matthew 8, 23 and 24. And I don't know about you, but I would kind of think you'd hope for maybe a little perkier second sentence, or maybe a happier consequence of obedience, like Jesus got into the boat and his followers went with him. Suddenly, a great rainbow arched in the sky, while a flock of doves are flying in harmony in perfect formation over a sea of glass that mirrors the mast of the boat. That's what you want to read from Matthew, but that's not what he says. And sometimes I think we think, well, I'm a Christian. Life is supposed to be like a calendar full of Caribbean cruises, right? And the answer is no. It's not that way. In fact, this story sends us the not so subtle and certainly not too popular reminder that getting on board with Jesus can mean getting soaked. Disciples can expect rough seas and stout winds. John writes in John chapter 16, verse 33, in the world you will have tribulation. John didn't say you might have it, you may have it, or you could have tribulation. John writes, in quoting Jesus, in this world you will have tribulation. In church, we know Christians contract COVID. They lose family. Christians battle addictions. I mean, let's face it, Christians face fears all the time. But it's not the absence of storms that sets us apart. It's who we discover in the storm. And in this case, it's an unstirred Jesus Christ, because in Matthew 8, verse 24, the tax collector points out the fact that Jesus was sleeping. Now, there's kind of a scene, right? I mean, the disciples are screaming and Jesus is dreaming. Thunder roars while Jesus snores. He doesn't doze. He doesn't catnap. He doesn't just simply rest. It says he slumbers. Now, I don't know, could you have slept through a storm like that? Could you snooze during a roller coaster? Could you nap in a wind tunnel? Or doze maybe in a drum concert? I don't think so. Jesus sleeps through all three at once. Mark's gospel of the events add two other very curious details. Jesus was in the stern asleep on a pillow. That's Mark chapter 4, verse 38. In the stern on a pillow. And you think, well, why the first and where'd the pillow come from? Well, let me explain the first. First century fishermen used very large, heavy, seine nets for their work, and they stored the nets in a nook that was built into the stern for this purpose. Sleeping on the stern deck would have been hugely impractical. It provided absolutely no space or protection. The small compartment beneath the stern, however, provided both. It was the most enclosed and the only protected part of the boat. So Jesus, tired from the day's activities, crawled beneath the deck to get some sleep. And he rested his head all right, but not on some like fluffy feather down pillow. This pillow was likely a leather sandbag. It's what they call a ballast bag. And again, Mediterranean fishermen at the time and even currently still use them. They weigh about 100 pounds and are used to ballast or to stabilize the boat. So did Jesus take the pillow to the stern so that he could sleep? Or did he sleep so soundly that someone rustled him up a pillow? I mean, we don't know. But we do know. This was a premeditated slumber. He didn't accidentally nod off. In full knowledge that this storm was barreling down the Galilean Sea, Jesus decides it's siesta time, so he crawls into the corner, puts his head on the pillow, and drifts off into dreamland. And frankly, Jesus' sleeping is very troubling for the disciples. Matthew and Mark record their responses in three very staccato Greek pronouncements and then one question. Here are the pronouncements. Lord, save, dying. And then here's the question. Don't you care? Lord, save, dying. Don't you care? They don't ask about Jesus' strength. I mean, like, hey, Jesus, can you still the storm? They don't ask Jesus about his knowledge. Are you aware of this storm? They don't even ask for his know-how. Do you have any experience with storms? Rather, they question Jesus' character. You don't care. But church, that's what fear does to you. It erodes your confidence in God's goodness. We begin to wonder if God can sleep in our storms, if his eyes stay shut when our eyes are getting bigger like saucers by the second, if he permits storms after we get onto his boat. Does he care? You see, fear unleashes a swarm of anger-stirring doubts, and it turns us into control freaks. Do something about the storm is the implicit demand of the question. Basically, Jesus, fix it or else. Fear, at its core, is a perceived loss of control. And when life spins wildly, we grab for any component that we think that we can manage to have control. Maybe it's our diet. Maybe it's the tidiness of our house. Maybe it's the armrest of an airplane, or in many cases, it's clinging on to people. But fear has another element to it. Fear deadens our recall. It deadens our memory. The disciples, when you think about it, had absolutely every reason to trust Jesus, because by now they'd seen all kinds of things from Jesus. Matthew himself, in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23, said Jesus was healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. I mean, the disciples had witnessed him heal a leper with a touch and a servant with just a command. That's Matthew chapter 8, verses 3 and verse 13. Peter saw his sick mother-in-law recover. That's Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 and 15. Do you see my point? The gospel writer is Matthew. And Matthew had recorded all these things that Jesus had done chapters and chapters before. And yet, in his gospel, he is recording his petrification and his fear at sea. And of course, the disciples had seen the demons just scatter like bats out of you-know-where. So shouldn't someone maybe just have mentioned Jesus' track record? Or maybe review his resume? I mean, don't they remember the accomplishments of Christ? Fact is, they may not have remembered, because fear can create a form of spiritual amnesia. It makes us forget what Jesus has done and how good God is. And fear feels dreadful. You know that. It sucks the life out of us. When fear shapes our lives, then safety becomes our God. When safety becomes our God, we worship the risk-free life. So then the question becomes, can the safety lover do anything great? Can the risk-averse accomplish noble deeds? And the answer is, not without God's help. Church, the fear-filled individual cannot love deeply because love is risky. The fear-filled cannot give to the poor because benevolence has no guarantee of a return. The fear-filled cannot dream wildly because what if their dreams sputter and fall from the sky? The worship of safety emasculates greatness. And no wonder Jesus wages such a war against fear. Interestingly, at least I think, Jesus' most common command in all of the Gospels is the fear not genre. The Gospels alone list some 125 Christ-issued imperatives, commands. Of these, 21 urge us not to be afraid, not to fear, have courage, take heart, or be of good cheer. The second most common command? To love God and your neighbor as yourselves. And you know how often that appears? 8. So, if quantity is any indicator, Jesus takes our fears extremely seriously. The one statement he made more than any others was this: don't be afraid. Jesus doesn't want you or me or us to live in some state of fear, and frankly, you don't either. And here's the proof. I want you to tell me the last time when you made statements like this: oh, my phobias, they put such a spring in my step. Have you ever said that? Or, I'd be a rotten parent if it weren't for my hypochondria. Or how about this one? Thank God for my pessimism. I've been such a better person since I've lost all hope. Have you ever said stuff like that? No. Jesus' question is a really good one. He lifts his head from the pillow, he steps out on the stern of the boat, speaks to the storm, but then says to the disciples, why are you fearful? Why, oh, you of so little faith? Now, granted, and to be candid and honest, fear is also a healthy reaction in some circumstances. It's like, the canary in the coal mine. It warns of potential danger. A dose of fright could certainly keep a child from running out into the street and get hit by a car. Fear is the appropriate reaction to a burning building or maybe a growling dog. Fear itself is not sin, but fear can lead to sin. And if we medicate our fear with angry outbursts or drinking binges or sullen withdrawals or self-starvation or vice-like control, we exclude God from the solution. And when we do that, we only make our problems worse. We subject ourselves to a position of fear, and we allow anxiety to dominate and then define who we are as people. Fear creates joy-sapping worries and day-numbing dread. Repeated bouts of insecurity can petrify and paralyze us. But hysteria is not from God. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and discipline. Fear may fill our world, but it doesn't have to fill our hearts. It will always knock on the door. Just don't invite it in for dinner or offer it a bed to stay overnight. Instead, embolden your hearts with a select number of Jesus' do not fear statements. For instance, Matthew 10:31. Don't be afraid. You are worth much more than many sparrows. Matthew chapter 9, verse 2. Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven. Matthew 6, verse 25. I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough. Luke chapter 8, verse 50. Don't be afraid, just believe. Matthew chapter 14, verse 27. Take courage, I'm here. Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Luke chapter 12, verse 32, do not fear, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. John chapter 14, verse 1, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. I will come and get you so that you will always be where I am. John chapter 14, verse 27, don't be troubled or afraid. Luke chapter 24, verse 38, why are you frightened, he asked. Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Matthew chapter 24, verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. And Matthew chapter 17, verse 7, and Jesus came and touched them and said, arise and do not be afraid. Most of those quotes are taken from the Gospel of Matthew. The landlubber who was terrified on his boat trip on the Galilean Sea. The promise of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, is really, really simple. We can fear less tomorrow than we do today. And then Matthew writes in Matthew 8:26, and so Jesus got up and gave a command to the winds and the waves, and it became completely calm. You see, our Lord handles our great quaking with unbelievable calming. The sea becomes as still as a frozen lake. And all of the disciples are left wondering, because Matthew records this in Matthew chapter 8, verse 27, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Church, what kind of man indeed? That's why we're here. To give God our worship through his Son, Jesus Christ, because it was that same Jesus who asked his disciples, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? And then he immediately spoke to the winds and the waves, and they became absolutely calm. Do you think Jesus is different now than he was 2,000 years ago? No. Jesus turned a typhoon time into nap time. He silenced waves with one word. And we've all shared our good portion of seismos moments in life. And the good news is, we're still afloat. So church, this week, stay in the boat. Please keep rowing. Because sometimes fears are just false evidence appearing to be real. I want to talk to you about a person who is fearless. And most of you don't know this person. I only know of her inferentially. There is one person who knows her really, really well, and you'll understand that in just a moment. But this person, her name is Dorothy Osborne. And Dorothy is going to turn 100 years old this Thursday. And Dorothy, along with her daughter Frances, watch these videos every Monday or Tuesday, depending upon their time and when that gets downloaded. Let me tell you a little bit about Dorothy. Clearly, she was born in 1921. That is at the tail end of the Spanish flu. Dorothy is turning 100 years old, living during the new pandemic, the coronavirus. Dorothy has been married twice. Her first husband she was married to for 47 years, and he passed away. And then she married the preacher at her church, who was a little bit older than she was, and they were married for 22 years, and he passed away when he was 101 years old. Let me tell you a little bit more about Dorothy. She lives so confident in this world, she does everything that she can to provide for others. And she models Jesus in this way. Her passion is sewing. Some people might say quilting. But Dorothy accepts donations from her community of just these scraps of cloth that she then puts into a pattern and makes these marvelous quilts that she then donates either to family members, church members, or the community at large. And just like Jesus, Dorothy knows how to take rejects and then sew them into something good. Now, Dorothy, I'm wishing you a happy birthday. And I promise you, I tried to talk to your baby boy, but you know Curtis is a little camera shy. So Curtis said I would have all the FaceTime and not him. But you know he wishes you a happy birthday too. Dorothy, thank you for being the loving saint that you are. Thank you for loving Jesus like you did. Thank you for raising 4 beautiful children, especially your baby boy Curtis. He is a treasure to this church. I love serving and worshiping with him. He's a marvelous man, and you've done well, Dorothy. We just hope that you have a terrific birthday. But most importantly, thank you for your Christian service by taking broken pieces of fabric and knitting them and sewing them into beautiful things that serve a useful purpose in God's kingdom. That is someone who's fearless. So let Dorothy be an example. So this week, if Dorothy could be here, and Frances along with her, she would tell you this. Her favorite musical is The Sound of Music. The hills are alive with the sound of music. And fitting into that theme, her favorite television program is The Waltons. Good night, John Boy. Good night, Mary Ellen. A couple other things about Dorothy. There you go. The one thing that she really does not like, I won't use the word hate, that's probably a little too strong, but she despises idle time. Dorothy, at 100 years old, can still thread a needle. Amazing. I need my cheater glasses to read like prayer requests, but she can thread that needle. Now, she has some problems hearing. She can't taste stuff like she used to. But when she grew up, preparing for her family, they would can 600 quarts of vegetables to tide them over for the winter. She knows what it's like to prepare. And then, here's the real good news. If you want to live as long as Dorothy, do what Dorothy does and drink 1 Ensure every day. That's what Dorothy says has given her the life that she's had. Dorothy lives a fearless life, and she's doing that in Oklahoma. You can live a fearless life and do it here in Escondido. But you've got to have faith that the Jesus that we came to worship today can still your storms like he did the disciples. And if you will walk with that kind of knowledge and that kind of faith, then problems that seem insurmountable to others are no longer that insurmountable to you. And in a world that is clamoring for something that's true and something that's right and something that's encouraging, you can be that person. And you never know when that moment might happen where they ask you a question and you can give them a response, and most importantly, you can give them hope. So this week, even remaining socially distant, you can still be a positive influence for good with the people with whom you come into contact. So church, just remember, sometimes fear, it's false evidence that appears to be real. Don't let it deceive you. Don't let it lie to you. Trust in Jesus, because he can save you.